The Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918-1919, often called the Spanish flu, caused about 50 million deaths worldwide, far more than the deaths from combat casualties in the World War I. In fact, it may kill between 3% and 6% of the global population. At the time, pandemic influenza was new to the world, and only people exposed to milder forms of influenza and earlier flu season had partially protection against this more virulent form of the virus. And since it happened in the pre-antibiotic era, heavily infected patients were likely to die from viral pneumonia and complicating bacterial infections. The pandemic started in January 1918, overlapping with the war for 9 months, and persisting in its aftermath as people traveled back to their homes. Indeed, the war played a major role in its spread and severity. In order to fully understand the role World War I played in the spread of the Spanish flu, we have to understand why it's called the Spanish flu in the first place. During the Great War, most of Europe was involved in fighting for either the Central or Allied powers. The war generally led to increased press censorship to stop enemy nations from learning potentially important strategic information. However, this censorship wasn't the case in Spain. As a non-combatant, Spain's media openly reported on the spread of what came to be known as the Spanish flu. Ironically, the virus did not originate in the Iberian nation, but it was often claimed to have due to Spain being the only place reporting on the disease. We don't know the exact way the Spanish flu spread, but we do know it reached Spain around May 22, 1918. The close quarters nature of military service and trench warfare helped the Spanish flu spread and mutate in a way we haven't seen in the nearly 100 years since that time. In January of 1918, 4 months before the ABC report, the first case of the flu was identified in Haskell County, Kansas. On March 4, 1918, a case was documented at Fort Riley, Kansas, and by March 11, it had reached Queens, New York. Due to the nature of transportation at the time and the amount of transport happening between the US and Europe because of World War I, the virus quickly spread globally. But let's find out how this spread came about in such a short time. World War I marked a turning point in travel. Prior to 1914, few people traveled long distances, limiting the spread of infectious disease such as influenza from one place to another and country to country. Indeed, some rural people could live for years without exposure to many of the infections that were frequent in cities. The war saw the mobilization and movement of large numbers of troops and related personnel, both within and between continents. It also uprooted the lives of millions of non-combatants, especially in Europe. People from places far apart became more directly connected and more liable than ever before to be exposed to any new form of the flu. Those from the previously isolated populations, such as Alaska or the Pacific Islands, were doubly vulnerable when first exposed to pandemic influenza. The outbreak in Western Samoa, for instance, killed 22% of the population, probably because it lacked protective immunity conferred by exposure to early forms of flu. Army recruits in World War I were brought together from a wide range of backgrounds to live in close proximity in army camps, barracks, troop ships and trench dugouts. Regardless of background, mortality was lower for those who had been in the army for longer periods of time. This suggests that in the months and years after recruitment, but before the arrival of the pandemic strain of the flu, soldiers became progressively immunized by exposure to seasonal flu, or to one or other of the bacterial infections that could cause fatal pneumonia as a complication of the flu. But how do we account for the arrival of the influenza pandemic in the 1918? Where did it come from? And why it was so deadly? We now know the molecular nature of the pandemic virus, having pieced it together with nucleic acid, analysis of viral fragments from pathology specimens, and from bodies dug out of the Alaskan permafrost, where entire villages had been wiped out by the Spanish flu. The pandemic virus proved to have some gene segments like those from pig and bird influenza. which explains why it was so new to humans in 1918. But such a new virus with animal features would have needed to evolve further to easily spread within the human population. Wartime conditions help it along, as people living in close proximity became infected and the number of infected people and viruses transmitted grew, the overall size of the viral population grew rapidly. In August 1918, a more virulent strain of the Spanish flu was documented in France, Sierra Leone, and the US. It is said that in the next 24 weeks the flu killed more people than AIDS killed in 24 years and the Black Death killed in a century. New research suggests this strain was essentially created in the trenches of World War I, as soldiers with mild strains of the virus were left in the trenches and those with severe illness were sent home. As they made the trip back home, they would infect those who came in contact with them, due to the highly contagious nature of the disease. This newer and deadlier form of the virus wasn't something new but rather a mutation. Those who recovered from the first strain of the virus in earlier 1918 were immune to the second strain, but still thousands died throughout the world. Although the pandemic influenza virus lived on the years after 1918-1919, it tended to cause less severe disease in later years. This was partly because people whose first exposure was to a small dose of the virus would have had a mild attack, and their immune response after that would have provided protection against any subsequent attack. Further, the practice of isolating people with severe influenza, which became standard once the pandemic was in full swing, would have limited the spread of the most aggressive viruses and favored the spread of variants causing milder illness. Conditions have changed in the century since the World War I, making it unlikely the pandemic influenza disaster of 1918-1919 will ever be repeated. Even if a nasty flu virus were to emerge again, there will be a fewer susceptible people to facilitate its spread and its evolution into aggressive pandemic virus. What's more, we now have medicines to help prevent its spread and to better treat the complication of severe infections.